Hey, Jeff, welcome to the Beyond Jaws podcast. Are you ready to talk about sharks?
I'm always ready to talk about sharks.
Awesome.
Well,
Love to hear that.
well, I'm really excited. I know Andrew is as well today. We have a really super special guest on today. It's Jeff Carrier. Jeff is now a professor emeritus of biology at Albion College in Michigan. He was a longtime professor there. Before that, he did his bachelor's, master's, and PhD at the University of Miami. And Jeff was also a former American Elasmobranch Society president. And among the things we're going to talk to him today about this fantastic new book he has. It's the third edition of The Sharks and Their Relatives, which is just published, and we're really looking forward to talking to Jeff about that as well. And also, Jeff and his wife Carol sponsored the Jeff and Carol Carrier Student Poster Award for the American Elasmobranch Society. And we'll be talking to Jeff about a little more about that today. So with that, Jeff, welcome to the show.
Well, Dave, it's a pleasure to be here, and Andrew as well. Even though you're up north in Toronto, you're not getting much of a summer of the shark.
No, that's we're getting a summer. I'll tell you that. We're getting a summer, but we're not getting the summer of the shark. That's for sure.
Oh. We've had 2 shark attacks here in the last 2 months, which is really unusual for us in Monterey. So we're just kind of turned into our own little summer of the shark here. Jeff, why don't you tell us, like, how did you get interested in sharks? What was kind of like, how did you get interested in this whole field of marine biology?
Well, I grew up on the northeast coast of Florida, in the Jacksonville Beach area. We spent a lot of time on the coast, a lot of sharks. You know from Steve Kajira's work, all the migrating blacktips, and we certainly saw enough of that. I guess the interest in sharks began on a dive. My next-door neighbor was a fishing guide, and he would take us out occasionally. He was also a former member of the underwater demolition team, the progenitors of the seals, called frogmen back in the day. Back about 1960 or so, we were diving. Actually, we were fishing, going out for some kingfish and bonita, and it was a terrible day for fishing. So he said, "Let's go diving." So we said, "Sure, what's diving?" And after about a 15-minute introduction to don't come up too fast and breathe through this round thing, we took a dive. First dive was to about 65 feet. We were kind of water babies, so clearing our ears was not an issue, something we were really accustomed to. So we made it down to the anchor. The very first fish I saw was a small shark. We looked at each other. It went one way. I went the other. And I think neither one of us thought we were going to survive the encounter. After we came back up, cleaned up the boat and whatnot, I went to the library, got every book I could find, which in 1960 wasn't very much, and it began there. I guess the decision to be a shark biologist came in the middle 60s. You remember Jacques Cousteau's special, The Underwater World of Jacques Cousteau? One of the early shows was called Sharks, fittingly. And there was this lady on there, and she was studying shark vision. She was looking at sharks' ability to discriminate horizontal bars from vertical bars. And I just thought that was fascinating. I said, I want to be her. That was, of course, Jeannie Clark. So she had the most profound influence of anyone on my choice of shark biology as a career.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Was she at the what used to be the Moat Marine Lab at about that time, in the mid-60s?
I think at that time it was Cape Hayes.
Cape Hayes.
But I think she was still at Maryland.
Okay. Okay.
Cape Hayes, and then Perry Gilbert came there. I think he courted Bob Moat, and that's where the name of Moat came from.
Okay. Yeah.
That's my version of history, but it could be cleaned up a little bit.
Well, at that time, most of the shark research was really revolved around shark attacks. Is that correct?
It's true. And Dave Baldridge's work with the Navy, and ironically, I grew up just outside of Mayport. It's a big naval base there, and quite a shrimp industry. The St. Johns River is up there, and it's a very, very rich area. As a matter of fact, during the Second World War, shark chaser was actually developed and tested behind the shrimp boats coming out of Mayport. So Mayport had its own tie into history with shark research, particularly trying to dissuade them from going after down flyers and sailors. So I guess Perry did a lot of work in the early years on shark chaser.
Yeah, he's definitely Perry Gilbert's definitely a prominent name in the early days of shark research, certainly in the 50s and 60s. Did when you obviously got this real interest in sharks and marine science, did you go to when you were looking to where to go to university? You obviously went to University of Miami. Did it have how was the program there at the time? Were they doing much going on as far as sharks specifically?
Well, actually, I started out at Florida State. My choice of Florida State was not really based on academics, but that's another story. I went there for a year, and when some career choices that I thought I was going to make didn't pan out, I dropped out and actually went into service. Back in those days, we had a military obligation, so I used that time wisely to sort of recenter myself. And I think I had some opportunities that really solidified my choice of marine science. My last duty station was on a buoy tender. I was in the Coast Guard. And we went on a long cruise. It was chasing a Navy special purpose buoy. We didn't really know what it did, but we were required to stay on station with it. Our captain, who I think was a marine scientist wannabe, arranged for us to have some gear on the ship that we should never have had. We had a bathythermograph, we had a plankton net, we had a microscope. This is a buoy tender. All we did was scrape barnacles off buoys and put new batteries in them and throw them over the side. But while we were on station with this buoy, we'd drag a plankton net, and he and I would sit on the fantail when I wasn't on duty and try to figure out what in the hell we were looking at. Copepods and all kinds of bizarre critters. And so after I got off active duty, I went back to Florida State. Decided to take on marine science, and they really didn't have much, not at the time. Miami had other courses, so it seemed kind of natural to transfer to Miami. I got there, the courses were good, and one of the first courses I took was from a guy by the name of Dave Evans. He was a physiologist, a fish physiologist, and I proposed a directed study as an undergrad, working with small sharks, and it just cascaded from there. It led into a master's, it led into a PhD, and the rest is my history.
Did anything in any of your graduate degrees involve sharks at all directly, or?
As an undergraduate, I did some work on salt and water balance in nurse sharks, and then parlayed that into a master's, contrasting salt and water balance in nurse sharks with Petamotrigon, these nasty little South American stingrays. Worst animal I've ever encountered. I have the
Why is
scars
that?
to prove it. Most encounters with a stingray are coincidental. You step on them, they don't come after you. Petamotrigon comes after you. They're a little bit like lemon sharks. Lemon sharks have the only thing on their mind is to try to kill the investigator. Well, Petamotrigon is much the same way. Nasty little.
So you were
animal.
stung a few times.
Yeah, more than a few.
Did you ever think to break off the spine at all?
Huh?
Do you ever think to break off? Exactly. About the fifth or 10th time, it's like, I think I'm going to break off these spines.
I think I'm going to wrap this study up.
Yeah, it made you go faster, I guess.
So
So a question for you in terms of like, you're doing your undergrad, then you do your master's at Miami, then you eventually did your PhD at Miami. These days, that doesn't happen a lot. Was that a common practice to stay at Miami to do graduate work, all the way through, or was that just more of an opportunity? They had the best sort of program at the time.
That's a hard question. In point of fact, they didn't take people in that kind of a degree program. Sometimes you could get in for a master's. But my undergraduate work was clearly going to lead to something significant. We were one of the leading labs in the world at the time. Dave Evans was a pretty prominent figure. And we were working against a lab in France run by Jean Metz, looking at sodium and chloride and potassium and urea and water movement across fish gills. Using radioactively labeled ions to trace their movement. And it was at the leading edge. So parlaying that into a master's was just sort of pro forma.
Right.
The Graduate Admissions and Advisory Committee didn't have any trouble with that. It's a little bit trickier getting in for a PhD, but again, it was one of those programs that it needed answering, so off we went.
So you've had quite a long love affair with nurse sharks and going back to your grad days and stuff. I knew in later years they've been your shark, been your go-to shark. So as you went along, you did your PhD and everything, and at some point you needed to actually get a job, after you finished your graduate school. How'd you happen to wind up in Michigan from Florida?
Well, as usual, that was a circuitous route. I got hung up on teaching more than anything else, and Dade County had a marine science curriculum that was in kind of bad shape. I did some lecturing for some high schools while I was a grad student, had a chance to take a look at the curriculum, and then was actually offered a job out of graduate school to revise the marine science curriculum in Dade County. So I took that on. That worked for several years. And then I was offered the job as a director of a marine lab down in the Keys. That was also interesting. The problem with that is that it was all administrative. There was no teaching. And so I decided I'd leave that and get into teaching. Now, if we have any current students, postdocs or whatnot, who are listening to the show, this will hurt them badly. When I decided to leave the Keys, I applied for 5 jobs. I put a circle on a map, center at Key West, radius of 1,000 miles, and vowed I wouldn't take a job south of that. I really wanted to leave the Keys. I sent 5 letters out and got 3 interviews. 2 of them were for tenure track, and 1 was a sabbatical replacement. That one happened to be at Albion. It was the first one, so I went to it. I got there on a Tuesday night. I called the chairman of the search committee, said I'm in town. And he said, well, your first meeting is in the morning at 8 o'clock at Robinson Hall. So I walked up to the room, knocked on the door, and went in the room. It was full of students. So I apologized, and they said, are you Dr. Carey? I said, yeah. They said, well, we're your interview committee. So the first group I saw at Albion was a group of students. So I was on my way from there to Southeastern Massachusetts University. Sandy Moss was there at the time. And I got as far as State College, spent the night, got a call from Albion, offered me the job. And I thought, if this is a college that'll lead with a group of students, that has that much confidence in its students, that's a place I want to be. So I took the job.
So let me ask you, the interview process, was it the students asking you questions, or you just put on a lecture?
No lecture at all. They started the interview process, went about 2 hours, and then I met with the members of the department, the provost, the president, yada, yada, yada. And it was great. But again, remember, this was a 1-year sabbatical replacement. So it probably wasn't as strenuous as it might have been had it been originally a tenure track position. After that year, the guy decided he wasn't going to come back, so the college was mandated to do another national search for a tenure track. So I applied for that and managed to survive it. And 35 years later, retirement.
That's amazing. I'm sure you skipped over quite a bit during that 35 years, but which we'll get into. But I really like that interview process. Do you remember any of the questions that the students asked you?
What in the hell are you doing in Michigan from the Florida Keys?
That was one of the questions. I love it.
A question that I asked myself a lot. No, they wanted to know something of my history. I had taught in high school. I had taken an administrative position, so that was a little non-traditional for what they were accustomed to interviewing. It was a good opportunity to challenge them a little bit, to get out of their traditional box. These were a group of kids who had been part of an interview committee for several other candidates. So obviously it went kind of quickly because I got a call the next day offering me the job. So
yeah, that's amazing.
I assume it went well.
That is pretty amazing. So when you went, it must have been kind of interesting when you went there and you started talking to these kids in Michigan about sharks. What kind of reaction did that have?
Well, about what you'd expect, that somebody's working with a real charismatic animal. So they were attracted by it. They wanted to know how many times I'd been attacked. They wanted to see all the scars and, the usual kinds of things you might expect. But some of their questions were very good. How is your work applicable to students at Albion College? Would they ever be able to get involved in your work? What kind of classes would you envision yourself seeing at Albion? You're hired to be a physiologist. What other classes would you want to offer? And so from there.
Did you actually ever teach any courses on just sharks? Any seminar classes or anything?
Oh yeah, there was a demand. We had a requirement for a seminar class, and the topics were quite varied. Our classes were small. I had many seminar classes with 8 to 10 students. And in the early 2000s, there was a marvelous book published that was absolutely wonderful for undergraduates to use. So I had a little in with the publisher, and we used that book.
Is that your first edition of The Sharks and Their Relatives?
It was.
Awesome.
And what made you decide to write a book?
Another long story, way too long. It is. In 2001, Mike Heithaus, who's somebody, if you haven't had on your show, you certainly should, was a postdoc with Mote Marine Lab. And he was working down in the Keys. I was down there. Ironically, I went right back into administration at Albion, so I was in the Keys trying to escape again on a sabbatical. Mike and I worked side by side for almost 16 months. We were running 2 sets of drum lines trying to assay the shark populations of the Keys at that time. And we were setting some long lines for small sharks back in the backcountry of the Florida Keys. And one afternoon we were out there, we were just sitting on the gunwale of the boat, passing time. And the conversation came up that there had just really not been a good book since Sharks, Skates, and Rays by Perry Gilbert. And nothing very comprehensive. Hamlet had put out his work, but it was mostly reproduction. And so we worked on a table of contents. Mike didn't know too many people in the field at that time. I had some good connections through AES. So we started making some contacts, see if people would be interested. I contacted CRC Press, and they mentioned that Jack Music had also mentioned the need for a good book. So I contacted Jack, asked him if he'd be interested in putting something together. He said, yeah. So I wrote the prospectus, had a tentative table of contents, ran it by the editor for the series, the Marine Science series. He sent it out. 3 days later, they said go. So there was a need.
That's amazing from someone who's written a lot of books to get a response that quick is pretty phenomenal, because most people go in and think, oh, they're going to love this book, and usually it's like weeks or months sometimes to get feedback. So the fact they came back to you that quickly, that's really terrific. That's amazing.
Well, Peter Leitz was the series editor for the Marine Science series, and he had written several turtle books with music. So I think there were some connections there that worked to our advantage. Yeah. And we had such a willing group of writers, and the book went on to win awards, so it came out pretty well.
Oh, it's one of those must-read books. Go ahead.
Well, it was fun to do, but you've written edited volumes. You know what hassle that can be. Andrew, we often refer to herding cats. I'll give you a different metaphor. Imagine trying to shovel frogs into a wheelbarrow, and you have a pretty good idea of what it's like to manage a bunch of authors and co-authors. This most recent book had 25 chapters, about 95 authors, and we did it during COVID. So it was your worst nightmare.
Yeah. And this is and one thing I let people know, this is the third edition. It came out. In fact, I got it right here, just to people see it. It's got an amazing cover there and the editors and stuff. But each of the previous two editions you did, they're distinct enough that I would tell people like to go out and get the previous editions as well, just because there's different chapters, there's different sections in there. No two are exactly alike. And it's really like, if you want to get especially if you're someone who's like a high school or undergrad who really wants to get into sharks, these are like really good precursors to really get your feet wet and take a shower essentially in the world of shark research.
Well, thank you for that. And I say thank you for a lot of reasons, since you were an author on one of our chapters in a previous edition. Well, we did now 3 editions, and we actually did a second volume along the way. So there's actually 4 of these. Next year in Virginia, for the student auction, I've assembled all 4, and I'm going to auction them off as the collected series. So I'm looking for that to bring in some big bucks for our students.
That should be impressive. Those are definitely 4 volumes you want to have, and to have on the book there. What's the so when you had the first one, obviously you did very, very well, and then you went on and did another one. What when you had the subsequent books come up, did you approach the editors, or the editor or publisher approach you on it, Jeff?
They came to us.
Sweet spot.
Yeah. The only time I ever went back to them was for a different book, the shark research, the emerging technologies and applications for the field and lab. That came out of frustration. I was actually, pardon my language, I was a little pissed off. I tried to find some work on drones. I love to fly my drone, and I wanted to know what other people were doing for research. I looked through the literature. I couldn't find a thing. So I thought, all right, well, I'll drop the drones. I'm interested in AUVs. There must be plenty out there. Not a thing. So I thought, all right, I'll fix your wagon. I'll write a book, and I'll just get the leading people in the field to write chapters, and that way I can learn about it. So that led to 22, 23 chapters on eDNA and imaging, just all kinds of stuff. And that has to be my favorite book, because it came out of frustration, and it came out so much better. Oh, my goodness. And we also pulled Colin Simpfendorfer into that book. And, boy, there's someone who is an incredible critical reader. He is really good. And it was a pleasure to pull him aboard.
You actually have, I can't remember the title. You have one book at least you wrote on your own. You just wrote yourself.
Yeah, Sharks of the Shallows. That was one to cover the species that we see down here in South Florida and the Bahamas. That was a fun book. It was written for, middle school, high school folks who don't really want to learn the details that we have in the other books.
How is it writing? I know what this is like, so I'm asking you, but your opinion. How is it to write? How is it to do a book where you're shoveling frogs into a wheelbarrow versus where you're like essentially the captain, first mate, and cabin boy of the ship yourself?
Well, there were times when I thought I was going to be the first and the last to go overboard. It was fun. It was different. I've written a kid's book before called Discovering Sharks. It was a small book, and it was very tough. I think the toughest piece of writing, however, was a piece for National Geographic. Wes and I wrote a piece a number of years ago. And as scientists, as you well know, our writing is anything but creative. We are very linear. We have blinders on. We write in a prescriptive format. And writing for Geographic, sea shark swim. Sea shark swim looking for a girlfriend. It's tough. It really is. And I think that writing something where you're the sole author and you're not writing for a professional audience, it's a little bit challenging. A lot of what we study is hard to reduce to a language and a style that people can actually understand.
I really marvel at people that can break down. One of the best guys I used to know, I know you knew him as well, John McCosker, could take a really complicated topic and break it down really simple. So a junior high school, kid could understand what you're talking about. And that to me is an amazing art to have, to be able to break that down and just so the average person can get it. Because I think too often in our field, we get really excited about the stuff, about these topics, about talking about sharks. But we lose the average person in the weeds because we're talking at using a lot of technical jargon because that's how we're used to talking to each other. But we're leaving off like a lot of people at the bus station because they're just like, well, it's really, you guys are really excited. We don't know what you're talking about. I think that's really an important area that needs to be people we need to think about more as scientists times to be able to convey that to the average, break it down so the average person can understand that.
Absolutely. And we're just not very good at that. Part of the work that Wes and I have done in the Dry Tortugas, which is a national park, has always involved giving evening lectures to people on the docks, telling them what we're doing, getting them involved. In the past, when we'd catch a shark on the dock, we'd actually let the people do the tagging. And they take a certain level of ownership by that kind of involvement. And that's the best way to get them sympathetic to the kinds of things we're trying to advance.
When you write your book, the biology of sharks and their relatives, now that's obviously for a science audience, right? That's a book for other scientists to sort of catch up and get updated on the new research and the new ideas. And then when you write for National Geographic, it's more of letting the people know, what's, in one article format of the new emerging research that's out there. Where do you find that you find it more for you during your career in writing these books? Where do you get the most pleasure out of writing? Do you prefer writing for a non-scientific audience, or do you prefer writing to help, sort of the scientific audience that you've been helping for so long?
Well, I think we transition a little bit during our career. We certainly want to impress other scientists when we start out, but we understand sometimes we're not going to accomplish that. And as Dave pointed out, it's a larger task to get after people who are interested, who may not have the scientific background or the expertise that we do, but they have an interest. It's genuine, and sometimes it's greater than that of a scientist. I spend a lot of time with kids. I work at a summer camp during the summer and work with 12 to 17-year-olds. Man, you can light a fire under these guys, and you've got them for the rest of their lives. It's the adults that are the issue. Kids aren't afraid of sharks. It's our parents, the Jaws generation. We got to get them out of that. I think when you light a spark in a kid, that is an accomplishment as an educator, and you got to just love it. I do a lot of. Go ahead. I do a lot of public lectures and spend some time talking to adult groups and children as well. And they're amazed by what we're doing with sharks, what we're learning about sharks, and what they can do. I always get a pretty good sized audience and get some fantastic questions. So the interest has always been there. Dave, you've done a lot of public talks as well, so you know what I mean.
No, it's always good to kind of reach out to the different people, but that's important. I always try to, you got to work at it to like make sure that the average person out there you can convey that enthusiasm so it translates to they understand why you're so excited about working on these fish, and just to have that passion about what you do. Really, hopefully, if nothing else, always hope people come away from it feeling passionate about whatever they do in life. Because as you know, Jeff, most people are not going to pursue sharks as a career. They might have a lot of good intentions early on, but once you kind of get in that career path and life happens, it's not always as easy as it might seem at times. So.
Well, we've seen funding sources dry up and the number of people in the field increasing. So you really got to decide you're going to compete, and it's not always easy to do. When we started the project in Tortugas, this was back in 1991, it was very clear that we were going to need underwater camera equipment, we're going to need boats, we're going to need good diving gear. So I put a second mortgage on my house and used that money to buy cameras, to buy a boat, and stake myself to the kinds of things I would need, because we couldn't coax money out of NSF at the time, and the work was just too important. So Albion's always been very good in supporting faculty research, and for the entire time I was there, I had good support, but not at the capital level that you need to buy a boat and the underwater camera gear that we had to have.
I don't know how your experience was.
No.
I know you've done a lot of things with like National Geographic and Shark Week and some of these things here. And I tell people, like, I'm able to do things I could never fund or afford on my own, but you get some of these TV shows that are interested in what you're doing, and there you got your project funded basically to go do. And even though they're doing it for entertainment, as long as you realize, and I understand they're doing it for entertainment, but if I can get what I need done out of it, to me it's a win-win for the way I look at it. And some of the stuff, like when you started in '91, I'm sure it was pretty wild. Like NSF, none of those things would have even entertained funding you. So, how was your experience with some of this?
Well, we got lucky when we went into the field and found this. Wes knew a photographer by the name of Nick Calionis. And Nick was quite an accomplished underwater photographer, underwater videographer. So we brought him with us in '94, I think. And that happened to be one of the banner years. And not only did we get some outstanding video, but Nick took some stills that ultimately resulted in the National Geographic magazine article. So we got really lucky there. And Nick had a good biology background. Wes knew him well. So that with the exception of a couple of lines in the National Geographic Explorer that we did, it was a fantastic show. Still one of the best I've ever seen. Nick went on to produce a show for Discovery Channel called The Ultimate Guide, Sharks. It is, without a doubt, the best shark special that I have ever seen. It was biological, but yet entertaining, and it would hold your interest. So we got luck. Now, modern days see everybody in the world being approached by when sharks attack. And I get a call from every year or two, and I'm not interested.
Yeah, I just look at
check it out.
say nowadays it's hard to convey to younger people like the landscape like 20, 30 years ago when you only had there's only very few options, and if like a BBC or a National Geographic called, it was like a bigger deal because there wasn't all this social media around or other opportunities to be able to do that stuff. So it was a real treat. Nowadays, just like you get so much coming your way. I mean, I just a lot of the stuff I just turn down. Just for one reason or another. And if it's something that gets my interest or there's something I could see like a benefit for, sure. But I think we've had Chris Lowe and some of the other people on there. We've just say like you just got to be ready to say no. Just walk away if it doesn't seem like a good fit.
Well, a lot of our younger colleagues won't say no, because they think it brings some notoriety to the institution, some advertising, and some camera time, which they think is to their advantage for tenure or promotion or the like. Every summer when Discovery Week comes on, it's like whack-a-mole. The same kind of nuts come out of the ground every year. They never publish a thing. They're not active scientists, but they're camera people. They'll show up in front of the lens, and then they go back into the little hole until next summer. It drives me crazy.
The field, again, young people listen to this. If you want to, be accomplished in the field, it's your publication record, really. It's what you publish in scientific literature. That's what's going to set you apart from just somebody from a TV personality, and that's where that includes books and other things. So that's really the currency of the field. Being on TV once a year is not going to really mean that much, and I don't think most of the universities don't really care that much that I'm aware of. They're like, yeah, okay, great, it's fine. What else have you done for us?
Yeah, where's your peer-reviewed publications? One of the things we've tried to do with these books is involve not only people who've been in the field for a while, but also some of the younger people. But I counsel them that they need to consider the gray literature versus the peer-reviewed literature. They're not going to get as much mileage out of a chapter in one of our books as they are from something that's published in a decent peer-reviewed publication. They're not going to get the circulation. It's not going to be indexed to the same extent. So they have to weigh where they're going to put their energy.
Yeah. Some of the nice thing about your book here is the chapters are very broad overviews of the different topics in there, which I think is great. But I always go right to the reference section after I go through it, because that's what I want to find out about. And that's really the important part to me is go to the primary literature, and that gets to your point about it's having your publications in peer-reviewed journals where people can go find them as a primary literature. That's really going to be the important thing for the younger people starting out in their careers.
Yeah, we've been very happy with CRZ Press. They've allowed us to make these literature cited sections just humongous. There's some chapters whose literature cited is every bit as long as the chapter. And if you've written a lot, then you know that the software for creating literature cited sections can be bamboozling sometimes. EndNote and similar ones are nice. They make it a lot easier, but it's still such a hassle to create a literature cited section that's got 200 or 300 references in it. And as an editor, it's no fun to go through and check the format of that either.
Oh yeah, because you have to be meticulous in that too,
I'd like to
right?
back up a little bit. You're at University of Miami, and some of the people you knew earlier in your career. You mentioned Eugenie Clark previously, and I know you mentioned before we went on, we've got Sonny Gruber. Could you talk a little bit about some of these people for some of the younger people in our audience? Like they hear the names, but they don't really, probably never had a chance to meet Jeannie or Sonny or Don Nelson or some of these people. Could you maybe talk a little bit about some of your early interactions with them?
Well, they missed some of the greatest people in our field, as you well know. Sonny and I were grad students together. He was out at the Marine Lab. I was on main campus. He was working with the lemming sharks, and I had nurse sharks on main campus. I think one of the personalities who you didn't mention, who was a big influence for me, was Art Meerberg. Art was a teacher out at the Marine Lab. He used to come to class with a cape, a top hat, and a cane, and he would lecture all dressed out. He was quite a behaviorist. He did a lot of good work with sharks. When I was a grad student there, he was working more with a little damselfish, partitus. He was looking at all kinds of displays and clicks and whirs and all that kind of stuff. He was tremendous. The first time I saw sharks mating was actually in 1977, long before Wes and I started. And I called Art, and I mentioned to him, I know he was interested in behavior, told him where I'd seen it, what I'd observed, and he didn't do anything with it. And then the next year, Pete Klimley actually published a paper on his observations of mating in the shark moat that was at the Seaquarium in Miami. And Pete was pretty good. He studied with Art and was there with Sonny. When we published the paper in 1992 or so, we were finishing up with the manuscript. I called Pete and I said, look, I've got your 78 paper and we're about to publish another paper, and what we found is considerably different than what you reported. I actually sent him a draft and whatnot. He was really excited. He said, well, yeah, mine were captive animals, and wow, this is really interesting, and yada, yada, yada. I just thought I owed it to him since I was going to be mentioning some things that were different in our study. So Pete was a good one. He was finishing, and I didn't see so much of him. I saw a lot of Sonny. And then I met Perry when he came out to the Marine Lab to give a lecture. It was called Sharks, Skates, and Rays, ironically. And he was just the consummate gentleman, one of the nicest people I've ever met. He was fantastic. We would do well to have the same kind of courtesy that Perry showed toward his colleagues.
I met
always
Perry
willing
Gilbert
to help. And
much later in the mid-'80s when I was a master's student in Greg Kaye's lab, and he was exactly the way you just described, a real gentleman, took the time to talk with you. He was just very much, and I think at that point he was retired, but he was just one of those guys that stands out, that, well, a real gentleman, just a really nice guy, took the time. When you're a grad student like that, you always remember that stuff, sticks with you later on in life. And just again, people listening there, he did a couple books. One was Sharks, Rays, and Skates, and the other one was on the Sharks and Survival. Was that the other one he did?
Sharks and Survival was the first one, and then Sharks, Skates, and Rays was the second one. I have 2 copies of Sharks and Survival, and one of them will be in the auction next year. So to fill in your libraries, AES people are going to have to attend that auction.
If you have a chance to pick up either of those books, they're kind of classic references for the field. If you're really going to be a student of shark research, it's always important to know your history. And there's a few chapters in the Sharks, Skates, and Rays that are one stands out to me as Stuart Springer, who's another really terrific person. But these are the important things that kind of laid the foundation for modern shark research today. Some of the stuff that was published back in the 60s. And as Jeff mentioned earlier, these were really the only 2 books in the 60s that you could get some kind of a bit of a breadth of knowledge in the whole field. And so those kind of books that if you can find a copy, get it. I really recommend it.
Well, Perry was someone who was just really exciting to be around. The first year we got the mating footage, I was on my way back to Michigan and stopped in Sarasota and actually showed Perry the video. He'd never seen sharks mating as much as he'd studied sharks. So I showed him the video and showed him the video and showed him the video and showed him the video. I must have gone through it enough to wear the tape out. He was just really excited.
I got to ask you another thing, Andrew and I wanted to touch on is that, so when you were at Albion, you had a kind of a bit of a unique parallel career as a football announcer for the games. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Albion was a small school, and it was a highly respected Division III school. one of the original Oberlin 50, the best liberal arts colleges in the country. And a lot of kids who would come there were interested in medicine, for example. They would go pre-med, but they were accomplished athletes and still wanted to exercise their years of eligibility and play college football. They didn't want to go to a University of Michigan or Michigan State or that O school down south of the border. So they would come to a school like Albion because they know the emphasis was on academics. And we had some sterling athletes, but we also reached a point where we had, and I may be wrong a little bit, we had 5 consecutive NCAA postgraduate fellowships awarded to football players at Albion. The only other school that could match that was the University of Nebraska under Tom Osborne. So we were really proud of our student athletes. In 1994, we won the Division III National Championship. We went to the Amos Alonzo Stag Bowl in Virginia, and that was quite an accomplishment. I had students who were on the team. I would actually start my labs in the morning at 5 a.m. for them so that they could still participate and go on the road during that championship run. It was a pretty spectacular group of young men. So you never lose your love for football. Every once in a while, after you get injured enough, you still can't get it out of your system. So announcing football was just kind of a way to stay close to the game, stay close to the students. I'd see them in class. I'd play noon basketball against them, and then watch them play on Saturdays. A phenomenal experience. So 40. That was a few years after retirement. I stayed. Yeah, I just couldn't get it out of my system. And it's rugged. The football season opens in a couple of weeks. The kids report to camp tomorrow up in Albion. And I talked to our basketball coach, Ashley, this morning. And so they're all geared up for soccer people to show up and football players. And then the season opens in, 3 weeks or so. My God,
you're staying right in there.
The beginning of the season.
Yeah. So how long?
Say again?
I was just gonna say, how long? Announcing takes up a lot of time. I assume. You don't just show up to a game. You have to do your research. I mean, I guess you knew the players from teaching and stuff, but how much time did it take, to do a game, but also prepare for that?
Well, I'd start preparing Thursday night. We would get the lineups from the opposing teams. I'd have to do my introductory remarks, which meant looking at the history of the series with a particular school. The MIAA, the Michigan Intercollegiate Athletic Association, is the oldest conference east of the Mississippi. And so we had some rivalries that have been among the longest in the country. So we need to go back and look at the records and you'd have to hype up the crowd. You got to get them wired up for it. Not trying to be WWE announcer or anything, but you got to get them wired up. So it was a lot of fun. I'd go into the press box about 8 o'clock on Saturday mornings, get all my stuff set up. Back in the early days, I actually used to run the loudspeaker system and play the pregame music. I remember the days when I once played the Macarena. I got chastised by that. Football players didn't really want to warm up to the Macarena. And yeah, not the right kind of movement. I'm not sure I could get prime for making the big tackle with Macarena refrains in the back of my head.
That's true. Getting back to sort of Albion and Shark research in general, being up in Michigan is probably not the most ideal place to study sharks. Was it a lot of to stay in that aspect of research and sharks, and to keep up with your knowledge of sharks and so forth, and your passion for that research? Did it involve just a lot of travel to do field work, or did you have sharks come to the lab? Did you order sharks for those physiological experiments?
Yes to both. We had good money at Albion. We had what was called the Foundation for Undergraduate Research, which provided some money for student faculty research. They had to be paired up with a faculty member. I was fortunate enough to have had an endowed professorship for, maybe 16 years. That provided a good deal of money to be able to support my research as well as student travel and student research. And then, the dark period of my research career was actually a joint project with the University of Michigan, their Department of Biomedical Engineering. We were paired up in a joint project, and they brought their lab over to Albion, set it up in my lab over there. We were brought together by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects. This is the black ops of research. And so some of the work was modestly classified, but I had 4 big tanks at Albion full of sharks. We had some white-spotted bamboo sharks, and we had nurse sharks. And we'd take these animals apart, do some single nerve cell recording, trying to see what they were responsive to in terms of amino acids or other olfactory attractants. And once we determined what positive effects this had on the brain and how this translated to motor movement, then the idea of the study is that you might imagine if you can map motor input or sensory input to motor output, maybe you can find a way to bypass the sensory input and just trigger a particular response. And so we weren't real keen on where that was going. So, but a long-winded answer to your question, that we had a lot of work at the college, but also the greatest percentage of our work was field work.
Did you ever, actually, as a complete aside, did you ever do much research there, like in the Great Lakes or any of the rivers around in Albion in Michigan, or was it pretty much just marine based?
Well, water didn't have any salt in it. Why the hell study it?
Okay, answer that question.
Fair enough. Good answer.
Well, I've been on salt water all my life, and I went swimming in some fresh water once. I jumped off the dock and I beat the anchor to the bottom. You can't float in that stuff. It's dangerous.
Yeah, you don't float in fresh water, that's for sure.
No, I never had a chance to do any freshwater work. It was when I had time to do any work, it was go south and do it.
So what's
Gotcha.
So now you've gotten all these different 3 volumes done of your latest sharks and the relative. Are you thinking you might be able to do a 4th one somewhere down the road?
That was a good one.
Well,
yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah. I swore I wouldn't do a 3rd one. So
so you can still be convinced then.
I can neither confirm or deny. I'm sure there'll come a time when somebody will bring up the subject, but we brought Colin into this process, and Kara Yopak, who is an incredible writer, incredible editor, and I'd like to see a transition ultimately to them. I think I need to pull back eventually. There are a lot of other things to do. I got involved with the project with the Georgia Aquarium last spring, tagging some manta rays off Cape Canaveral. That was really exciting. That was kind of a bucket list. And now I have a couple of friends and colleagues who are working on sawfish, and I intend to insert myself there somewhere, somehow. I've been making my vote available to these
That
studies.
helps.
I've got a couple of different boats, one for shallow water, one for deeper water. And yeah, and I go along, and they can have my boat as long as they tolerate my being along. So.
Yeah. That's the goal. Is you come with the boat, which is, hey, let's be honest. You're a shark expert. It's not a bad idea to have a shark expert tag along on a shark project, right?
Yeah. Well, tag along on a shark project maybe, but tagging along on a manta ray project. Oh,
Yeah.
Those are big animals.
Those are big animals.
Well, it was fun because we were using some of the vets from the Georgia Aquarium who are really accustomed to working with these animals. Mm-hmm. We had an airplane that was our spotter, and it was fantastic work. We were also given a little latitude to come in close to Cape Canaveral, so we were less than a half mile offshore from Launch Pad 39C, which is where all the SpaceX stuff is going off from. So,
cool.
We actually saw the Artemis 1 on the pad. She was since taken off, and now she's been rolled back out, and she's going to launch on the 29th of August, I think. So that's going to be pretty exciting. And to follow up on this theme, the Crew 5, which is a SpaceX project, September 22nd, has an astronaut who is a physics major at Albion College. Josh Caseta is going up for 6 months on International Space Station.
That's really
so we're excited about that.
Yeah. So I guess obviously you're not slowing down at all. You have plenty of stuff to keep you going.
I'll have plenty of time to slow down when my ashes are out there somewhere.
You kind of like
floating around.
I'd like to ask you a question we ask all the guests is like, what advice would you have for young people starting out and students considering a career in the field or somewhere in the sharks or marine sciences? What advice would you give them?
Diversify. Make certain that your background is as broad as it possibly can be. Don't log in on every science course you can take. Look at the social science. Look at history. Better look at economics. You might ought to think about taking some religious studies courses. Ask people in Hawaii for their culling problems that occurred a number of years ago when they found out that sharks were ancestors, and got a lot of feedback from the public out there. I think the broadest possible background you can have is the best. Meet people. Don't be afraid to ask questions. We're both biased because we're members of AES, and we know the advantage of meeting people and talking to people. Mm-hmm. Our society is the most open to students of any group of people I've ever encountered. A kid comes up, got a question, they're going to get an answer. If you're going to apply to graduate school, do your homework. Find out what the lab is doing. Find out how your ideas, your interests can articulate with that lab. Make a place for yourself. Got to do your homework. Just saying, I want to work with sharks. And go get it done.
The Carrier Poster Award, you and your wife Carol sponsored. What was prompted you to do that out of other than just kindness of your heart? Do you have any?
Well, we saw the Gruber Award and these students presenting great papers, but there can be just as much information and solid science in a poster as there is in an oral presentation. Plus, you have the advantage of really going one-on-one with the creator. You can find out more about it. They're not reading from a stock script. They have to be fast on their feet. And I just thought it was such a shame that we weren't rewarding that kind of scholarly activity. So we created the endowment, gosh, I don't even know, 15 years? I don't know. Britt Finucci, one of your more recent ones, and you touted her as being a winner of the Jeannie Clark Award. I would note that, first of all, she was a Carrier Award. I just want to let people know
that my graduate student, Rachel Aitchison, was this year's winner. But that had nothing to do with having you on the show today, Jeff. That was pure coincidence.
That's true. That's true.
Oh, I tell you, I try to sneak up on these students. I turn my name tag backwards because a lot of these are younger students. They don't know who I am, but I always want to see them. I have no input into judging. But I always want to listen to what the students have to say. And she was just top notch. I'm telling you, she did you proud. And I was very happy to see her award.
That was good. She won it.
She won it honestly.
I'm there most years, but
So.
It made me really happy to have one of my students. It's always when you're a professor and you have one of your students win an award, especially something like that. It's really special. Really special to see. So,
And Jeff, I'm glad you brought up sort of how important the posters are, because I feel as though when people go to conferences, the big goal is to present your paper or your chapter or some sort of project that you're doing at one of the sessions, at one of the oral sessions. And the posters are never really, although they're really interactive, I feel as though there's a feeling of it's like second best, in terms of getting a poster, and some people may not like it as much, but I agree with you. I think it's one of the best parts of the conference, because it's a great way to network, because you have something to talk about, because you're talking about your poster. You're the only one who really knows what you did on that poster, so you're the expert at that moment in time, and you get to interact with everybody who comes by and ask questions and essentially touts your presentation. You get to meet potential collaborators down the road, maybe future supervisors, and I think it's just a really great part of a conference that people undervalue, I feel, until you get to a conference and you actually get to speak to, even being in the audience part of that and get to speak to. I love that aspect, and I think more and more people should do posters. I think it's a really great way to network and just to present your research over and over and over again, because that's essentially what you have to do. It makes you really know your stuff and be able to communicate that stuff. So I'm glad you and your wife have provided an endowment for that to incentivize students to do that type of work, because I think it's really important.
I think sometimes there's a value in maybe presenting a poster early on in your work. You can discuss that, and as you say, collaborations come out of it, suggestions for directions come out of it. There's no doubt that in an oral presentation you have a bigger audience, and you can get your science out in front of a larger group. But I don't think it diminishes the value of a poster to have a smaller audience.
I know, I always
greater
my
interaction.
If you're going to go to a conference, at least do a poster, even if it's a preliminary thing, because it's a perfect way to network, because people will come around, like Jeff and others will come around, you talk to them, you get to meet people, and that's what it's all about. And that the posters is kind of a good sort of handshake. Hi, here's who I am, and gives you a talking point to start off with, especially when you're a student. You want to meet some of the people that have been around the field for quite a while and stuff. So I think it's a great thing that you guys have done. I was trying to remember, it's probably been 15, 20 years since you started, but I think it was a terrific idea you and Carol came up with, and really, really glad to see that happening with AAS.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, AAS has always been very, very student friendly. Very much, I've always done a lot for the students there. It's definitely of all the societies I've belonged to, it's definitely been one of the best, I think, over the years. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Well, we've certainly enjoyed supporting these young people, watching their careers blossom. And we have our leadership team, that are former students. We've watched them develop as scientists and as leaders. And isn't that what it's all about? Absolutely.
Yep. No, it's great. Jeff, as we kind of end this, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking about your career, talking about all the extracurriculars you did through your career, and continuing on, studying sharks. I think it's something that you don't get to hear about a lot of the times, and I'm sure a lot of people are really happy to get to hear your voice and not just read your thoughts in these volumes, and be able to hear you to speak and to get to know you a little bit more. And I think it's just great to be able to have that opportunity to meet you and get to ask questions about your career. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We'd love to invite you back, talk more about your trips with manta rays, and see what's happening with the sawfish, and looking forward to hearing those types of stories.
Well, there's some stuff on sawfish that will make you drop your jaws, I promise you. It's not my study, but there's some stuff that was presented at AES and some stuff that's going on right now that is beyond shocking.
Perfect.
And I'm going to leave
Great
you with
teaser.
that.
Yeah, that's a great teaser.
Thanks, Jeff.
Well, fantastic. Thanks a lot, Jeff. Really appreciate it. Looking
ya.
forward to having you back on.